Good afternoon. I'm Amelia Parnell, Vice President for Research and Policy at NASPA, and it's my pleasure to introduce our third speaker, David Hoffman. David is Assistant Director of Student Life for Civic Agency at the University of Maryland, Baltimore County. He's an alum of UCLA, where he served as Student Body President and a University of California Student Regent. He earned his JD and MPP degrees at Harvard University and his PhD in Language, Literacy, and Culture at UMBC. If you happen to see David strolling about the conference in the next couple days, feel free to come over to him and talk about fantasy baseball or chihuahuas. He really likes both of those. But if you don't want to talk about sports and you don't want to talk about animals, you can talk to him about the CLDE meeting because he served on the 2016 Planning Committee and he'll be on the 2017 committee, and he's a member of the ADP Steering Committee. So maybe that's a little better than baseball and animals. I should tell you that his speech today will be a little bit different than the first two, and that it takes place 30 years into our future. He's going to be speaking to us in the Civic Learning and Democratic Engagement meeting in the year 2046. So in order for us to see him, we're going to need to send our imaginations forward in time. So I'm hoping that you'll join me in an exercise. Would you close your eyes and lean toward the future? I think I'll do it with you. I won't fall off the stage. All together. So welcome to the opening session of the 2046 CLDE meeting. Here's David Hoffman.
Thank you. I heard a good suggestion to give you a moment to address the physical. So I would actually like to invite you to stand up and stretch. Do a little dance. Shake out the arms. And when you're ready, have a seat. All right. Well, good afternoon again. Many, many years ago, when I was in my teens, I used to fill idle moments by imagining how I'd navigate the following scenario. Abraham Lincoln has traveled forward through time from the year 1865 to the present day, and it's my job to explain to him what's changed. I'd be sitting in the backseat of my parents' car, staring out the window, thinking about how I'd respond to Lincoln's inevitable questions, like, what force is propelling this vehicle? And why aren't the gentlemen wearing hats? Today I want to challenge all of us to engage in a similar exercise. I want you to imagine that a participant in the Civic Learning and Democratic Engagement meeting from 30 years ago, in June 2016 in Indianapolis, has traveled forward through time to the present day, June 2nd, 2046. No doubt they'd ask the inevitable questions like, what happened to all the gas stations? And what happened to all the cell phones? But because this was a participant in the Civic Learning and Democratic Engagement meeting, we can also be confident that they'd be curious about how our politics and our democracy have changed in the intervening 30 years. How would we help someone freshly arrived from the year 2016 make sense of the world we take for granted here in 2046? In order to get us in the right frame of mind for this, I have revived an ancient technology called PowerPoint. I want to highlight 3 things that would genuinely shock a visitor from 2016, and then go back and tell the story of how these surprising features of our everyday reality came into being. I'm not talking about the obvious progress since 2016 when it comes to justice and inclusion, but about more subtle aspects of our daily experience. In fact, the first is something that has not happened. Despite the dire predictions from earlier this century, our world has not degenerated into a steamy hellscape of melting ice caps and rising oceans. In fact, the mean global temperature is lower here in 2046 than it was in the year 2000. Now, that's not because the world's scientists were wrong about humans causing climate change. The temperature is lower because in the face of a series of catastrophes, we changed our relationships and our practices. We'd been slowly adapting to a warming world, but then came the great Mississippi flood of 2021, the blizzard of 2024, and the water wars of the late 20s and early 30s. In the wake of the devastation, we turned with great urgency to adapting our democratic relationships to meet the world's need. Technological breakthroughs have helped in the last 15 years, but those would have been impossible if we hadn't first learned to reach out across our divides and talk to each other as people with a genuine collective stake in a common future. Second surprise for our visitor from 2016 is that our national elections are not horribly divisive and embarrassing spectacles. In fact, they're more like celebrations. Now, even if you're too young to remember it, we all know what the election of 2016 was like. Just try to imagine the mindset of someone who was at that civic learning and democratic engagement meeting in June of that year. Okay? We were worried. We had a sense of what was coming. But it was partly because of that fear and the fury that was unleashed in the months afterward that we finally took action on a scale needed to address the widespread sense of powerlessness and marginalization being experienced by people in every political party. Our elections are more like celebrations now, in part because so few of us experience them as our one chance to influence the direction of the nation. We're working together all the time in our career roles, our neighborhoods, and our networks, building community and solving problems together. The third surprise for our visitor from 2016 is that we have built our society around the idea that democracy must be enacted anew. Oh, I'm sorry, I skipped one bit. I want to mention the voter turnout rate. This is an important part of our future as well. So we still hear concerns about the voter turnout rate. But thanks to the good work of organizations like Circle and the Youth Engagement Fund, those concerns come mainly from young people wondering why their elders are lagging behind. But from the perspective of a visitor from 2016, the fact that the overall turnout rate is steadily above 90% would be plenty impressive. So that third surprise. We have built our society around the idea that democracy must be enacted anew in every day and year in the living relations of person to person in all social forms and institutions. This is the real revolution. As you may know, that phrase about living relations comes from John Dewey, and you might have heard it repeated at a meeting like this one, even in 2016. But our educational practices at that time, at every level, often reflected a very different orientation. For one thing, many of us in this room today were working hard back then just to carve out space in the curriculum and campus activities to prepare students to participate in democracy. We made good use of the space, but it tended to be isolated. A student might return from what we then called a service learning experience, which we now call simply a learning experience, to a campus on which they were regarded too often as merely a tuition-paying customer or an empty vessel waiting to be filled with knowledge. Still, even back then, the very best of our programs, practices, and environments could inspire a sense of the world as fluid and open to transformation through people's actions. They encourage students to discover and experience themselves most fully and truly in the context of authentic relationships, which we describe with words like mutuality and reciprocity. I learned about the importance of those relationships through research I conducted starting in 2010 with students who had achieved a very strong sense that they could make a difference on campus and beyond. I wanted to understand how had they gotten past the sense that they had civic power only in isolated spaces. What they named was that they'd occasionally found themselves in conversations with older adults and peers that departed from the usual scripts. A conversation with an advisor or a professor or a student leader that felt real, that made them feel present and visible, and that led to the development of a genuine mutual relationship, gave them a tremendous sense of civic power and possibility. When the relationship felt real, the students felt real, and they saw hope that they could make real change happen together. Now, more than 30 years later, we'd call that exact sensibility, that feeling of individual and collective civic agency, a cornerstone of our national culture. It's a hallmark of the relationship we expect among faculty colleagues, between faculty and students, and more broadly in our workplaces, our neighborhoods, and our congregations. We cultivate democracy in each other, and that would truly surprise a visitor from 2016. Maybe even more surprising would be the story of how we got here and the central role that people in higher ed concerned with civic learning and democratic engagement have played in that story. Here's how it unfolded. In the aftermath of the 2016 election, we, the people, had a moment. Just like the terrorist attacks in September 2001 generated a wave of public spirit in the US, however briefly, the 2016 election generated a wave of yearning for reconciliation. Across the nation, we saw local, idiosyncratic grassroots actions to bridge divides. On the political right, these efforts tended to have names with words like restoration and civility. And on the left, healing and transforming. But what they shared was a revulsion for reducing people to stereotypes and pitting them against each other in the way that politicians and pundits then tended to do. Our work at our institutions helped to fuel this emergence of new thought and action. Seeds we've been planting for years with our deliberative dialogues, our service learning programs, and our community engagement efforts took root and produced blossoms. At my own institution, we'd been carefully building a network of students, faculty, staff, alumni, and people from across the region who were collaborating in some surprising and empowering ways to promote justice and community on campus and beyond. And that work rapidly became central to our whole sense of institutional identity. And by the 2020s, all this work, all these grassroots actions had permeated our national culture. In higher education, just like everywhere else, false dichotomies and reductive distinctions fell out of vogue. We stopped drawing bright lines between what we had called the curriculum and the co-curriculum, between academic affairs and student affairs, campus and community, service learning and every other kind of learning, between democracy plazas and every other space on our campuses, teachers and students, college and real life. Now, back in 2012, when a report called A Crucible Moment had championed the integration of democratic commitments across our institutions, not just in isolated centers, that had seemed like a distant dream. But by the 2020s, we were enacting that reality together. Our work became more integral, relational, organic, and generative. And one of the key insights behind that work, which is really an old idea we just hadn't fully embraced to that point, was this. Democratic engagement and civic agency are capacities that can and must be developed not just in individuals, but in groups. And individual development and group development are interdependent. That was a groundbreaking idea on the cusp of the 2020s, because back then, higher education's approaches to fostering civic learning and democratic engagement focused mainly on the development of individual students and far less on building collective agency on the part of groups, whether groups bound by history and geography or groups bound by institutional affiliation. The learning tended to happen in group settings, but the capacities were understood to be individuals' capacities. And that made some sense 3 decades ago. Higher education was under tremendous pressure to demonstrate its value. And that was understood to mean providing data about individuals and their skills and their experiences. But if individual and collective capacity for democracy were truly interdependent, then we had to expand our focus to better encompass the collective, our relationships and our practices, how we interact when we teach and learn and produce knowledge. And individual capacity could be developed strategically in ways that would support collective capacity, which could be developed strategically in ways that would lift up individual capacity to new heights, which could be developed strategically in ways that lifted collective capacity to new heights. And by the late 2020s, this had become known as the pyramid model for deepening democracy. We were applying it at our institutions and in our communities with astonishing results. Now, when I think about the basic insight behind the pyramid model, I'm reminded of the old idea that democracy is like jazz, with individuals improvising and collaborating to produce works that resonate far more deeply than the individual components ever could. Well, we wouldn't teach jazz merely by developing individual students as good soloists. We have to develop the individuals and the ensemble together. And the pyramid model oriented us to the need to build democratic ensembles in which faculty, staff, students, alumni, and our neighbors and our partners develop and experience collective power to shape our common destiny. The final aspect of our journey that I want to share with a visitor from 2016 is how we've used these annual civic learning and democratic engagement meetings to organize and support our work. The reality is, before 2016, these meetings had been variations on the traditional academic conference. And don't get me wrong, they were much better. They were much, much better. They were much more interactive, for one thing, but not nearly as interactive as they've since become, because in 2016, we started to shift our thinking about the uses of these gatherings. We started to really embrace the idea that we're not just a collection of individuals with overlapping concerns. We're a movement actively organizing to produce the living democracy that we envisioned and needed, but at that time did not yet have. And that meant orienting ourselves to new questions. We continued to ask, what practices and models can we share with each other? But we also focused much more intently on how we could pull together for collective impact. So we asked ourselves, if you're a scholar committed to living democracy, but the civic dimensions of your work are being marginalized at your own institution, how do you start to build support for culture change? And if you're a student who wants to live a meaningful life as an agent of positive social change, how do you connect with other students to gain influence over your own education and over the future of higher education? And how can we, as scholars, practitioners, students, and partners in higher education, deepen our sense of connectedness and common purpose and our capacity to influence the culture of an entire nation? We've been answering these questions side by side across institution types and across campus roles because we truly see the civic potential in each other. These meetings have helped to produce a living democracy because at these meetings, we are living democracy. Let me conclude by sharing one last surprise for our visitor from 2016. The President of the United States will not only appear at this meeting, but is hosting it. But that shouldn't be a complete surprise, because she was with us 30 years ago in Indianapolis in 2016 when she was an undergraduate student. Thank you.